Evidence-based practices are not just the strategies and practices and interventions that have um, empirical and research support, but they're also ones that are found to be effective. So just having the support doesn't qualify them as effective. It needs to be the big picture. These are also interventions that lead to positive outcomes for students with disabilities. So as we're talking about evidence-based practices or EBPs, this is what we're referring to specifically. Evidence-based practices are based on high-quality research, and we'll talk about what that means in a little bit according to different standards. But it's high-quality research with different types of students in different places with different behaviors. So we're not just looking at students who are in first grade in a suburban school district or fourth grade in an urban school district. It's a range of different types of students in a variety of places. It can be hard to really get that participation level when we're talking about some populations that we work with. For example, if we're talking about students who have intellectual disabilities, we may only be talking about a very small part of the entire population of students who receive special education services. Therefore, it becomes difficult to get that range of students over places and over time because there just aren't those participants out there. But when we're talking about evidence-based practices, we're talking about interventions and instructional techniques that can be used with a wide range of students. The other piece of this is that it is measurable. So we can actually get some sort of concrete data on the effectiveness of an intervention or of an instructional technique. At the foundation of why we use evidence-based practices is the belief that we as teachers and educators want to do what we can, and we want to be the most effective when it comes to instruction. So we want to maximize those student outcomes. We want to make sure that what we're doing counts. So evidence-based practices help kind of bridge the gap between what we know works in the research and what we're actually doing in the classroom. Evidence-based practices, when you hear that word, that title, it gives us an indication as educators that this is research-based and it's sound. It's something that is effective with our students and that can really work. So it kind of bridges over between what universities are doing, what we're doing within the Office of Special Ed, and saying, okay, let's take that information and now apply it to our classrooms. Evidence-based practices, it's important to know where to look. The place that you don't want to look is typically the internet. You don't want to go to do a Google search on good reading interventions. Typically what you will find when you do something like that are package programs which may or may not be evidence-based. When I say package programs, I mean things like reading programs that are available for purchase that schools may buy and put in place, and that kind of goes into this training program as well. These training programs or these reading programs, math programs, are not necessarily research-based. The programs have not been taken into the schools by researchers outside of the developers and actually tested on a variety of students in a variety of locations. So be cautious as you are looking for evidence-based practices that you're not just getting Google hits on things that are popular versus things that work. Although evidence-based practices have become kind of a buzzword within states and counties and even within some of our regulation, there's not a very systematic process for identifying evidence-based practices. A lot of that has to do with the fact that our populations within education are so varied, as well as the different types of methodologies that can be used in order to conduct research. For example, quantitative versus qualitative research versus single subject. So we have these challenges that really hinder how we determine evidence-based practices. So there's a lot of discussion about how to identify evidence-based practices and kind of who sets the standard for making these determinations. You will see that the Council for Exceptional Children in the next slide has their own standards, but overall, in terms of kind of what's on the What Works Clearinghouse, which is through the Department of Education, we don't always see agreement on what has been considered to be highly effective versus just effective. and the Council for Exceptional Children decided to start looking at evidence-based practices and determining what type of evidence was acceptable for meeting these standards for what qualified as effective as evidence-based. And so the Council for Exceptional Children went through the four methodologies, being quantitative, being experimental, quasi-experimental, as well as qualitative and single subject, and wrote out indicators for all four types of these methodologies in terms of what the research should include in order to be evidence-based. In other words, they said in the method section, we should be able to see who the participants were, what area of the country it was in, as well as procedurally we could replicate the study if we were to kind of pick up the research and carry it over to the next county, to the next state, to the next group of students. So that outline started about 10 years ago, and that was a very long discussion, and there were numerous articles that were published that really dug through the research and determined exactly what should be included to qualify as evidence-based within the scope of special education. Now, what Works Clearinghouse sees the gold standard as is different. They see the gold standard as being experimental research. The problem with true experimental is that there's no randomization, and you have to have a large number of participants in order to get to that point. Unfortunately, in special education, we may go into a school and only have, 15, 20 students with a learning disability. By the time that we go through the whole county, we still only may have, in some counties, maybe 100, maybe we have 1,000, maybe we have a couple, but that's still just not enough to get that big or that big participant base that we need to meet that gold standard of true experimental. So there's this discrepancy between what Works Clearinghouse wants for us to do within research and what we can actually do given the fact that we have such small populations within certain disability areas. In the end, CEC said these are the four types of research that evidence-based practices can be based on. And I forgot to mention the correlational in the last slide, but these are the four types of research that could qualify if the methodology, if the analysis, and if the conclusions are presented in such a way that meet these standards that the CEC set up. The standards that were just mentioned through the Council for Exceptional Children really came out of some references within the law about evidence-based practices. We started to see this in the early 2000s, and essentially the President's Commission and the Secretary of Education were saying that we need to have some scientific evidence that helps guide teachers in making instructional decisions. No Child Left Behind also alluded to evidence-based practices, but it termed it scientifically based research. And essentially this is the same idea as evidence-based practices, in that the research should involve rigorous, systematic, and objective procedures. So again, we're looking to see that the types of interventions and instruction we're using is research-based. On the next slide, you'll see the criteria for those scientifically based research according to the legislation that was passed through No Child Left Behind. We can look at evidence-based practices and determine what the research says, what populations it should be used for, and what the effectiveness is, but it's only as good as these two considerations that you see here, which is the fidelity of implementation and progress monitoring, because without these two components, the evidence-based practices really are meaningless when it comes to the application within the classroom. In a nutshell, fidelity of implementation says that we are implementing the intervention or the instruction exactly as it was designed to be delivered. And what that does is it makes sure that if the research showed that a specific intervention was found to increase reading scores by X number of points, that if we implemented exactly the same way that it was designed, we should see the same results. And if we don't implement it with fidelity, then we should not expect to see the same types of results as were found in the original research. So fidelity of implementation really tells us how we should implement and what we can expect in terms of results if we do it the way that it was designed. Progress monitoring is another means to the end. And what progress monitoring does is it tells us whether or not the instruction or the intervention is effective. This is our way of keeping track of what we are doing and whether or not we are meeting the students' needs. The terminology of progress monitoring was also mentioned in some of the President's Commission on Excellence in Special Education in the early 2000s. Progress monitoring is also known as curriculum-based measurement. And oftentimes it's also kind of tied into the response to intervention. So I have two websites at the bottom that you can click on to see what that might look like over time. An integral part of evidence-based practices and scientifically based research is the peer review process. What the peer review process does is it ensures that the research has been examined by other experts in the field and examined for flaws, examined for methodological problems, examined for bias. And what that does is it makes sure that it hits a standard within the field before it's disseminated to others. I talked earlier about where you don't find evidence-based practices through places like Google. But the place that you do find it is in educational journals, such as Exceptional Children, Beyond Behaviors, Learning Disabilities Quarterly. All these are educational journals that go through a peer review process. So anything that's published in those have been in the hands of several experts within the field, and they have kind of also put their stamp on the fact that this research is reliable and it's valid and should be disseminated to the public. The review process is also mentioned in IDEA, and it talks about the fact that IEPs should also include some sort of statement about services and aids that are based on the research, and it talks about peer-reviewed research. So you can see all of these kind of terms and all this language all tying back to this idea of what evidence-based practices really are. Peer-reviewed research is also mentioned and applicable to individualized family service plans, things like behavioral interventions, positive behavior intervention supports, as well as professional development activities. All of these components tie into that peer-reviewed research review process and are all mentioned within the legislation as well. So what the heck does all this mean for special educators? What this means is that to the greatest extent possible, teachers should be paying attention to where the research is coming from, whether it's coming from a peer-reviewed journal, whether it has been shown to be effective within multiple populations, and to know the research behind the procedures that have been used within the articles or within the research. It's also important that if you are utilizing some sort of intervention or instructional technique, that you are doing so with fidelity and doing it exactly the way that it was designed. So take a moment and think about where the interventions that you're using came from. What did the research say about it? Who were the participants? And was it quality research? As an educator, make sure that you take the time to dig into the research. If you're being asked to implement a new intervention or engage in a new instructional practice, ask to see the research. Ask what population the research has been conducted on. Ask what the findings were, who conducted the research. All these are really important questions when we're talking about special education practices and making sure that we're using the most effective practices with our students.